in this interview here, I'm going to have him just lay out, what are the different questions and worldviews and perspectives of boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, and Generation Z. And the reason we want to talk about this is we want to learn how can we function together as a church family, number one, but then number two, how do we navigate the complexities of intergenerational leadership? And so, hey everyone, this is James Chambers here with the ReachMillennialsNow.com. I have a great interview for you today. I have my good brother, the Right Reverend Dr. James Choung, everybody. You say hello, James.
Hello, hello. Greetings.
That's my brother, man. We've served together at Intervarsity for a long time together. Had some awesome opportunities to do seminars together and do training together. And this brother's heart for the Lord is just amazing. He's very passionate around a couple areas. I would say, number one, a heart for the church and wanting to see the church become all the church can be and Jesus' vision for the church. Number two is he did his dissertation at Fuller around the leadership, postmodern theory and leadership development from the shift from modernity to postmodernity. So those of you that have been watching the course can know we've talked a lot about that. So I feel like you'll be able to learn a lot from James in this regard. But he's also the author of Real Life, a Christianity Worth Living Out. And he's looked at the distinctives between the different generations. And so in this interview here, I'm going to have him just lay out, what are the different questions and worldviews and perspectives of boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, and Generation Z. And the reason we want to talk about this is we want to learn how can we function together as a church family, number one, but then number two, how do we navigate the complexities of intergenerational leadership? And so those of you that are taking the course have known that that's one of the things we've talked about. This is real boots on the ground perspective now that Dr. Choung is going to share. So James, could you share just a little bit around, as you were doing your dissertation, what were some of the highlights that kind of stood out as you studied the transition from modernity to postmodernity and why it's important for the conversation we're having today?
Oh yeah, I mean, they're absolutely different worldviews, and that was a major shift. So modernity, this idea where modern ideals or values are sort of taking over, they really, the boomers were the last full generation to carry that. And so after them, the Xers on really started taking on more of the values of postmodernity, and really around the big shift around who gets authority. And in modernity, authority was around truth, around rationality, around being objective. And that shifted heavily in postmodernity, moving more towards experience, subjectivity, sort of the understanding that everyone comes with their own filters and their own point of view. So no one can claim to have like an ultimate kind of truth. And you can imagine that how much that ministries had to shift in the ways they related to people because some of the old assumptions disappeared and moved into the new thing. So that's like the high level. The authority basis shifted. So then how do we do ministry in a place where people aren't looking for like an absolute truth in the old ways, and their truth is much more personal, much more relative. And how do you speak to folks about then Jesus and who he is in light of all of that? So that was the big overarching thing. And that sort of then, as I was researching that, which was the first what I was thinking of going through, I ran across stuff around generational theory as well. And there was a book by Strauss and Howe called Generations, came out in 91. You can still get it on Amazon. And but if you get it, I'm just saying, I gotta warn you, it reads like an encyclopedia. So it's not like super like well written, but the theory behind it is ridiculous. It was a New York Times bestseller at the time. Al Gore bought it for every member of Congress. It got more notoriety lately because there's others who are using it for political ends, but it's not political at all. What it uncovered in this crazy way was that there was a 4-generational cycle in American sort of culture, and that it repeated itself between, and I'm going to use terms from a later book called The Fourth Turning, but it's the same idea, where there's a prophet generation, then a nomad generation, then a hero generation, and an artist generation, and that repeats every 4 cycles. And although the authors have been accused of sometimes being selective with their data to fit their theories, that back in 91, they predicted what millennials would be like. So at that time in 91, millennials were at most about 8, 9 years old. And they predicted using this theory what they would be like as adults, and they were spot on.
Wow.
Which made Strauss and Howe then become the ultimate. They were the experts on millennials at the time and wrote books like Millennials Rising and others that a lot of people look to understand the generation. So it's from there then I sort of took all that stuff and said like, well, is there something spiritual behind that? And started thinking about what was the main driving spiritual question for each of the generations, primarily Boomer, the prophet generation, Xer, the nomad generation, Millennials, the hero generation, and iGens, which are up and coming, the artist generation, and then started thinking about what was their main spiritual question, and then how that could actually then impact the way we minister to each generation. Thinking of them like subcultures rather than just all putting them into one big bucket.
Yeah, this is really interesting to me. And when I read your book, Real Life, first I love the way you wrote it because it was all in story form, and which was phenomenal. It was more like reading a fiction story, but around how did you disciple people from different generations, or even what are the questions that the different generations are asking. So if you were to bring that theory down into practical ministry application, what are the 4 questions that each of these different generations are asking, and how do we posture ourselves based on who we're talking to in order to disciple them effectively?
A great question, and I'll try to keep it on the shorter side, the briefer version of it. This can be like seminars and long kinds of workshops. But Boomers, being the last fully modern generation, I think they still ask what is true, right? People in the 60s and 70s, which are the Boomers, they really want to focus on the Word of God, right? And they can't understand why the other generations don't seem to care about the Word of God as much as they do. Well, it was your primary spiritual question. And then evangelism strategies were about that, right? Like when you're trying to reach out to the generation, it's like, how do you prove that Christianity is true? And so you have apologetics, and you sort of try to argue in such a way to say like, well, the Bible that we have is very close to the Bible that was written, that Jesus actually walked on the earth, that he actually died, that he actually rose again. And if you can actually make a compelling argument to those truth claims, well, then you have to believe, right? And back when they're young, when a generation is young, they get the cultural limelight. So this is back now in the 60s and 70s, when they had the cultural limelight. The main cultural critique against Christianity was that it was not true. It's a superstition. Believe in evolution. We have sciences that now tell us what truth really is. And so obviously you just follow this superstition, this myth that's a crutch for you. And that was the big debate, if you remember. But when we shifted to Xers, and you could probably tell if you're 60s and 70s, that generation next, they didn't seem to care about the things you cared about. I think their primary question, and there's lots of reasons behind this, but I'm just going to have to skip that. I think their primary...
Get the book, everybody, get the book.
Yeah. I think their primary question was, what is real? It's a generation that really valued authenticity, and they're the best BS detectors on the planet. They smell it. If it's propaganda, marketing, feels like a script, they can smell that a mile away. So in reaching out to them, we realized in Intervarsity, we just couldn't just argue, right? So we started having speakers share about all the vulnerable places in their life, stuff they wouldn't share with everyone, and then how Jesus authentically meets them in that. Yeah. And it actually goes like, oh, you're being real. I can trust you. Yeah. Which is why coffee shop ministry, all that stuff happened around that time. And the critique, if you remember when they were young, the 80s and 90s, the critique around Christianity was like all of our leaders were falling in really public ways. So they're like, Christians don't walk the talk. You're a bunch of hypocrites. Yeah. I don't know if you remember with all that tele-evangelists that were following. Yeah. So that was the main critique against Christianity there too, as well. They were talking about the other things, but the main one is you guys are fake. You're a bunch of hypocrites. And to Xers, that's the worst thing you could be is fake and inauthentic. So reaching out to them was building trust, being real, dropping the masks so that they could know the real Jesus that you follow. That's why they were so against formal religion so much, because that felt fake to them. They really wanted to get it real and tell me how Jesus meets you there. Well, with millennials, sort of the generation after them, so those folks are now pretty much in their 20s and 30s. Millennials started asking a different question. They weren't so concerned about that. They're more optimistic, civic, upbeat. They wanted to change the world. I think their question was, what is good? And their spiritual question. So what does the Christian faith, how does it contribute to the common good? And so the way you see a lot of it shifting in sort of the wider culture, where there was like a social entrepreneurship, where if you buy a pair of shoes, we'll give a pair of shoes to people who are in need. You buy a pair of glasses to the need. If you vote on American Idol, we can get mosquito nets in Africa to help stop the malaria epidemic. Like, this was the kind of stuff that was happening constantly, because they want to know how you're contributing to good.
Yeah.
And so we just found, like, some of our most fruitful evangelistic activities to millennials was to take them on service projects. We would have hundreds of people who weren't Christian busing down from New England down to New Orleans after Katrina. And they would serve, but they would also study the Bible, and they would see Christian community in action serving. And hundreds of people would become Christian on these trips. I mean, it was their most fruitful evangelistic activity. We would have large campaigns on how fighting sex trafficking is deeply about the gospel, right? And having like these huge events, one particular in New York City on, I think, 20 to 30 campuses. Those are the kinds of things that really seem to get traction. And if you remember the critique, so they would have been in the limelight in the noughts, so 2000, and the teens, the 10s till now. You know, the main critique about Christianity is Christianity's not good. You know, 56% of Americans believe that radical Christianity is just as threatening to America as radical Islam. They just think religion's a problem. It makes you intolerant. It makes you bigoted. It makes you narrow-minded. So if we stopped being so religious, we would all get along. Have you heard this before? Like sectarian violence, terrorism would stop if we would stop being so religious. Which is so, like, you have to ignore so much of history, right? Like, if you remember the major atheistic movements like communism and how many lives those claimed, brutal. But it's funny how that story is singing these days. So just to say that what is good. And so if you're presenting a Christian faith to millennials, that's really all about the benefits that you receive after you die. You can see you might be missing a whole generation. And what would it look like to present a gospel that actually shows how you're supposed to kind of be a part of the kingdom now, as well as the kingdom to come, right? What is good? And so if your church isn't contributing to the common good, a millennial will be like, well, I'm used to playing on teams. I grew up in extracurricular. We usually achieve something together. So if your church isn't going to do that, if your team's not going to do that, I'm going to move on to the team that's going to do something good in the world today.
James, there was a conversation that was had on doing this outreach for the AIDS pandemic, and came across a law student, knew we were a Christian group, and was just like, look, I don't want to talk to you all about anything you got to talk about. We were like, hey, you don't want to talk about saving the AIDS victims and, you know, bringing awareness and mobilizing resources to help them? He said, no, I'm all about that. But I know you're a Christian, and I don't want to just wait till they get to heaven and get healed there and have a better life there. I'm going to law school so I can affect change now. So until you do that, kind of like peace out. Like what was happening inside of his heart was like, those were kingdom dreams, right? That's the kingdom of God that's burning in his heart. But because he saw no Christians in his world and no churches in his world living out the good, just proclaiming the good, or even hoping for the good in another life to come, he thought that he had to do it without Jesus. So I really appreciate the perspective you're bringing on this. You've been a church planner, a pastor. Obviously, you speak on a lot of conferences, and you're the vice president of innovation and strategy for a very large international organization with 1,500 staff or whatever. So you see a lot. Sure. The people that are watching this interview are ministry leaders. Some are pastors, but a lot of the people that are watching are probably just everyday ministry leaders that may not necessarily be in a church context, that want to just reach younger people. And they have questions around, okay, I'm a Gen Xer, I'm a boomer. How do I need to shift in the way I think so that I can actually speak to to a millennial or to a person in iGen so that they hear me? And that transition is not always so easy for a person for the first time. It's like basically like a person going on a mission trip for the first time. How do I cross cultures? Do you have any tips, things that a person from a different subculture can do to enter into the other subculture?
It's a fantastic question. And yeah, if we start throwing iGens in the mix and the question of what is beautiful, that's another total angle.
Oh yeah, did I cut you? I'm sorry. Talk about that if you want to.
I think it's fine. I think this is great because it's about millennials. I think we can move on. Mm-hmm. If you're a boomer, so all four of those questions are really important. That's kind of what I'm saying. And I later found out those are the 4 questions that Greek philosophers asked to try to find out what the essential is. So I was like, oh, I didn't know that. Me and Aristotle, look at that. No. But, I just found out about that. So what you do is every question is important, but they won't get to your question unless you answer their question first, right? So their question is the front door question. Then you have to answer their question. So with that in mind, if you're a boomer, so you're in your 60s and 70s, and you're trying to relate to Xers, right? And I think your temptation would be like, but the Bible says, and this is the truth, so you got to listen to me, right? And an Xer was like, I don't have to listen to you. You haven't built up enough trust with me. So if you really want to reach out to Xers, so they're in their 40s and 50s, they still really value authenticity. What is real? Yes. So your best first move with them, and don't be manipulative about it, but share a story of failure. Talk about how you messed up. Talk about the ways, and that's hard for boomers. But to really say when I was 30, I did this, and it really messed up my life. Or when I was 50 and I made this decision, it was such a bad decision. And this is how Jesus helped me out of that. If you start talking about your failures and become vulnerable and not try to be shiny with your leadership, Xers will trust you and follow you to the end. They're very loyal once they trust you. But you have to get over that initial distrust by sharing stories that, frankly, show how you're not as good as you think you are and how God can help you in it. And isn't that the gospel, right? To go down, to go up, to die, to live.
Yeah, that's
to
good.
Serve. For boomers that are trying to reach out to millennials, I think we've touched on that. You can't just say the Bible says, because they don't always go well, where are you getting that from? Yeah. But if you can tie what you're talking about to how that's going to help them change the world. Okay. They love big vision. They love to see how this affects folks outside of your church or outside of your community. And they kind of need to be reminded a lot. I think I would say pretty much, and this might feel like a pain to boomers, because once I said the truth and you got it, shouldn't you change and live by it? But millennials kind of need to hear that vision at least once a month, if not twice a month, to really say frequently. To remind them your job right now, this is how it connects to the bigger thing. This is how it's impacting the bigger thing. And they stay motivated. And the fact is they need that because Xers sort of grew up without parents, right? Latchkey kids, that kind of thing. So they have life skills. So if they buy in and they're loyal to you, they know how to make things happen. Millennials, as they're older in their 30s, they're starting to figure some stuff out. But 20-something millennials still they got these huge dreams, but they don't know how to get there. Yeah. So sort of keep painting the dream. So they'll have a lot of your values, boomers, about changing the world and doing things that are good. And if you keep putting the dream in front of them, they'll get excited, and then you can help them with their next steps. Be real practical with them. Don't give them high-level paradigms. Tell them, how does this work in this week? How does this work in this next month? Yeah. And the more you can apply things to their everyday life, they're in. So get practical with them. Don't keep it at theory. Don't just give them a principle from Scripture. Show them how that applies today, and they'll listen. Now, the cool thing about millennials is they're not like Xers. So a lot of boomers out there got burned by Xers, like your kids or sort of the next generation. And in generational theory, it is the prophet and nomad generations that always fight the most out of any intergenerational kind of coupling. So don't be burned by that. Meaning Xers, and they're a lot of work. I admit I'm an Xer. Millennials, however, want older input. They grew up in child-centric homes. They actually don't have the same kind of you didn't look out for us that the Xers have. So reach out to millennials. Reach out to 20, 30-somethings. They would love to hang out with you and learn from you. And especially if you're giving them practical advice, they're in. iGens, so 20s and 10s, sort of that crew, they kind of have to have a sense of wonder or beauty, a sense that this is transcendent. So they're a lot less kind of wanting to know the exact application for how this works out today in that way. They're actually kind of interested in how they are going to be practical in their own life, not like the millennials. So millennials are big dreamers but don't know how to get there. iGens will actually be more practical in their own life. So they're going to keep needing kind of bigger vision of a supernatural world that they don't know anything about. Sort of picturing, having experiences with God. They're going to be drawn to that because they tend to be more practical in their everyday life. And so conversations around beauty and holiness and the best kind of life. How do you live the most excellent life?
Yes.
That's where iGens would be excited. But, you know, that's for people under 20. You might not have to deal with that for a little bit. We do, because we're in college.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing this, and I wanted to have you on this interview because those of you that are watching, I always encourage you all to think like missionaries. You know, most church in most local churches, we don't have to think like missionaries because people come to us. But in today's culture, they haven't been coming as much, so we have to go to them. And the first thing that a missionary really does, which Dr. Choung really laid out so well, is ask the questions that they're asking, that the indigenous people are asking, and meet them where they are in their felt need. Just missionary one-on-one, you know. So I just encourage you all, if this was a helpful interview for you, I want to encourage you to go and get James Choung's book, Real Life, A Christianity Worth Living Out. It unpacks these ideas more and puts it in real-time application. He wrote it in story form, like actual ministry conversations would take place. So I encourage you, go get that book from Amazon.com, go ivpress.com. You can get it there as well. James, thank you so much for taking time to share with all of our audience. I appreciate you so much, man.
My pleasure, James. Good to see you.
Now, if you found this video helpful on how to reach millennials and Gen Z with the gospel, I want to invite you to a free training that I'm hosting later today, showing you the exact principles and strategies on how we reached over 4,000 millennials without watering down the gospel. If you click the link below or go to reachmillennialsnow.com, you can reserve your seat for this free training. And I'm going to show you step by step where to find millennials, how to understand them, how to share the gospel with them, and how to develop them into leaders who help you reach more of their peers. So go to reachmillennialsnow.com. And as always, if you enjoyed this interview and this training, please hit the subscribe button to get notified when the next video drops. We usually drop one every week. And then also hit the like button. It helps us get the gospel out to more people on YouTube. So God bless you. I look forward to continuing this journey with you.